Great to have you all here, and it looks like a really great and diverse group. So I'm sure we're going to have some really fruitful discussions today. So I'm going to now throw over to Florence, who is going to kick us off with some of the background leading up to the thematic briefs, just to help locate and put this in context. So over to you, Florence.
Thanks a lot, Beck. Yes, as Beck said, we wanted to make sure that we just provide the framework, the background to this initiative, to the development of the thematic brief, and so that you have that context and you see where this work fits in and why it's being done. One of the milestone, one of the real achievements as a community in relation to children's care was the work that was done in 2019 to influence the United Nations, and particularly the General Assembly, that was working on its first resolution around the rights of the child for children who are without parental care. And as part of this, the General Assembly debated the issues, and there was a large coalition of actors that worked to advocate very concrete steps, very concrete recommendations for strengthening, for making care systems better. In fact, you can go to the next slide, Beck. There's a bit of background. Can I ask if you can mute yourself? Thank you. As part of that work to influence governments, and the UN General Assembly is the coalition of all governments, member states of the United Nations. So it involves really all of the governments and the policymakers. And as part of this, as I mentioned, there was a large group of organizations, civil society, UN agencies, network, care leavers, individuals, care experience parents and advocates that worked together to influence that agenda. And that coalition of actors made a range of what we call the key recommendation. And that became really our common agenda. That became, that brought together both local, regional, and global actors behind some key recommendations. Next step, please. And I'm not wanting you to read this, but to give some examples of the recommendation. There were very concrete recommendations, or was still quite top level, but concrete recommendation around the participation, the right to participation of children, young people, those with care experience, both in relation to the decisions that affect their own lives and the care decision, their placement decision, their transition decision, but also the crucial role that they have to influence and advocate and shape the care system, learning, drawing from their own experiences. So the key recommendation, that document had a number of recommendations specifically addressing those points. Next slide, please. And it also addressed the question of transitioning from care, recognizing, learning from many of you and the work that Care Leavers Network and advocates have done, that one of the fundamental challenges part of care system is often the lack of support, the lack of planning, the lack of resources to those who are transitioning from alternative care back into the communities. So the key recommendation addressed that as well, and addressed also the right to make decision, the right to participate in care reform and to shape that system. Next slide, please. So as a result of a lot of advocacy, and the key recommendation addressed a whole range of issues, but these are the ones that I was flagging there. The resolution was adopted by consensus, so all governments across the world agreed to some fundamental steps. They made a commitment, and that included some commitment in relation to transitioning. This is the article in the resolution which talks about the support that's needed for transitioning from alternative care. They also made some more generic recognition of the importance of participation by children, young people, adults with care experience. Language was a bit weak on that, but it's still recognized as part of the resolution. Next slide, please. So what did that mean? How did we follow that up? Many of you know and were involved. A year later, actually 2 years later, because of the pandemic, there was another opportunity to follow up on that agenda. In other words, to follow up on those commitments by state and to kind of deepen them. And that was in the context of the Committee on the Rights of the Child that held a day of general discussion on children's rights and alternative care. And one of the way that this agenda was moved forward is that we actually had, for the first time, very active representation by care leavers, by care experienced children, young people and adults, also by parents advocates, to the event, and both directly as being speakers, but also as through their contribution, written contribution, through survey. So that was actually unprecedented, that we finally were able to put those who have direct experience, direct expertise of the system directly at the table, speaking for themselves and unpacking what needs to happen to have a system that actually better serves their needs and the needs of other children and young people going into the system. Next slide, please. So now that we have, to some level, we have a common agenda, we have some top level recommendation. With the day of general discussion, we've had also a rich discussion directly from those with care experience at the global level about how the system needs to be transformed. The community of actors has got together and under this Transforming Children's Care global collaborative platform. And this is basically this, many of you will be familiar with it, some of you may not, but it's this large community of actors working globally, working locally, regionally, nationally, as well as global advocates to transform systems and to strengthen what's happening globally at country level to make care better for children and young people and adults and families. And as part of that collaborative platform, we have a working group that is looking specifically at global advocacy and policy. Next slide, please. And that global policy and advocacy working group discussed and debated what comes next. How do we need to move, how do we move forward this agenda? Okay, states have made some commitments. Some of the commitments are very concrete. Most of them are still very top level. And one of the decisions that this group made was that we needed to unpack those commitments. We needed to have more detailed recommendation that clarified to governments, to decision makers, to funders, to all those influential actors, what actually needs to be done to strengthen children's care. And in order to do that, we needed to take all of this discussion, the key recommendation, the UNGA resolution, the day of general discussion and outcome, and unpack this into a series of thematic briefs that would literally take each of these and provide more details about the action that states, governments, decision makers need to take to implement this commitment. So it's not enough to say what should be. It's important to say how to do it, to start unpacking so that we're being clear to government what needs to happen. So we're looking at practical measures that must be taken across these different areas of care reform to actually achieve that change. We're also looking at this thematic brief to provide country case examples. They don't have to be perfect example, but how is this implemented? What works? What are some of the interesting examples in relation to these different areas of care in different contexts? Because countries, there's a diversity of systems and contexts, and we need to ensure that our recommendation really respond to the situation. Next slide, please. So in order to develop the thematic brief, the Global Policy and Advocacy Working Group proposed that there would be a series of task forces that would be led by different members. These are some of the ones that have already been established or that are in the process of being established. And each of these task force would be made of actors, members that actually see that they feel that they have expertise, they have contribution to make, and they will be working together on developing the thematic brief. And next slide, please. one of the key aspects of course, the care system and the recommendation is around two things: the transitioning from care, leaving care and transitioning from alternative care back to either families or communities, and the support that's needed. And the second part is the importance of having care experience leaders, experts, those who have that direct experience, being able to advocate for themselves, but also for the systems, for the strengthening of the system. What system is needed? And one of the Global Policy and Advocacy Working Group's thinking was that the expertise around transitioning, the expertise around the care leavers engagement and the care experience leadership is with the care leaders, it's with you. And so for this task force, we hoped, and you being here today is really a measure of that, this task force could actually be led by you, and could, you at the forefront to help shape that discussion and also shape and develop that thematic brief. So the agenda really of this group, of this task force, is first of all in this meeting to have the discussion about how this task force can operate, and then of course handing over to you the discussion around how to develop this thematic brief. So that's really what we're here today to discuss. I hope that was clear enough, but happy to take questions or discuss this further afterwards. I'll hand over to Beck.
Thanks, Florence. Thanks for going through that. We will perhaps open it up just in case there's anything people want to clarify, but maybe we'll just go through this one final slide before we do that, because this also gives you a bit of additional background information to help you think through what comes next in the development of this particular thematic brief. And this is, as Florence mentioned, just understanding that there are many different topics that are being developed into these thematic briefs. As Florence shared with you in earlier slides, you got to see what a range of them are. And so one thing that's important to understand is that each brief does not need to cover everything. And all of the different aspects of children's care and care reform, they obviously all link together, and there can be areas of crossover. So one of the things to really be thinking about, and this is for every group that has created a task force to develop a thematic brief, is how to make sure we understand the parameters of each brief so that we aren't trying to cover what's essentially going to be covered in one of the other thematic briefs. So it's understanding those borders, those boundaries, or those parameters. So in this diagram here, you can see some of the other thematic briefs that probably have a natural intersection with the topic that you're all here to discuss today, so that you can start to understand when we're looking at this whole topic of transitioning from alternative care, we don't necessarily need to go right down into the detail of those family strengthening or reunification or reintegration processes. Obviously, depending on the age of the young person, there could be a crossover there. And so it's understanding that the detail of that particular area or aspect of children's care will be covered in a different thematic brief. So in this brief, there might be a point that you want to mention that or that needs to be discussed, but it doesn't need to be in a lot of detail. And you can see that with some of the other briefs that are in this diagram too. So when we're talking about transitioning out of care, it might be that there's some aspects of that the conversation leads towards more what would be a systems reform or the deinstitutionalization agenda. And again, that is going to be covered in more detail by another task force who is looking at that as a specific thematic brief. So it's understanding those intersections, but it's also to say part of your process may very well be at some point to reach out to other task force and ask to have a discussion with them to make sure that the thematic briefs are aligning with each other without duplicating content, or hopefully we won't end up in a position where we've got content that conflicts with each other. But all of that can be part of the process, because ideally what we want at the end of the day is a series of thematic briefs that together as a set provide great guidance to governments and decision makers, as Florence mentioned. And so it's important to make sure that they align without duplicating. And each of the briefs are quite brief. They're quite short. So it's really important to really understand the lane that each brief sits within so that you can provide that level of guidance and very practical detail to government and decision makers, which is not possible if the brief extends out and becomes too broad. So it's understanding the boundaries for the purpose of being able to go deep enough and be specific enough within a document that's essentially still going to be reasonably short. I think the upper limits that were suggested in the guidance material was approximately 10 pages. And so on the other side of the screen here, you can see that this is just a bit of an outline of what's in that guidance document that's been shared with everybody, and we can circulate that again at the end of the meeting for anybody who may not have seen it yet. But really what is sort of being looked at within the context of each brief is that there will be a short introduction to the theme. There'll be a text box that references any key legal or policy frameworks or the recommendations that were in the UNGA Rights to the Child resolution or in the Key Recs document might be in that particular box. And then it gets into that more practical policy statements that summarize those fundamental changes that are needed to move the systems reform effort forward with respect to that particular theme. Concrete steps and approaches to be taken to drive implementation, practical recommendations, and then, as Florence mentioned before, a case study from a country that just gives that more, more practical understanding of what does this look like when it's actually being implemented in a context. So that's what we're sort of looking for within each of the thematic briefs. So hopefully that just helps you understand the parameters of this particular subject, and then what we're sort of looking for in the formatting of that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm going to share with you a Jamboard because we're going to now move into more of the discussions section of today's workshop. But before we do that, I just want to give everybody an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have based upon the background information that Florence has shared with us in this section today. If you've got any questions, please just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. No questions for now? Okay. If you do think of something as we continue on, you're welcome to ask questions at any point, or you can always put something in the chat if you're more comfortable proposing a question using that function as well. So now I'm going to reshare my screen, and I'm going to give you access to a Jamboard. I'll pop the link also in the chat here so that if you would like to participate directly in the Jamboard, you can actually bring that link up on your own internet browser on your screen, and you'll be able to go in there and also add in sticky notes or type in any text that you want to contribute directly, but we'll also share it via the screen and take notes so that people can participate that way as well. Okay, so hopefully you can see that up now. And so in this section of the meeting, what we want to just firstly kind of describe or propose before we get into the discussion is the roles and the responsibilities of the group. Obviously, we're hoping that one of the outcomes of today's workshop is that we will have a clearer understanding of who from within the group would like to commit to being part of this process moving forward. But in order to do that, you need to obviously have more information about what those roles and responsibilities of the group are. As we also mentioned in the email and in our previous meeting, for those of you who were part of that, we are looking at providing a stipend to compensate people for costs or remove any barriers essentially to your participation, and that might be technology barriers and internet cards and things like that, but also your time. So we will discuss that, and they are obviously connected to the roles and the responsibilities. So there's two roles that we're looking at fulfilling within this group. There's facilitator roles, and then there's member roles. So we'll go through the facilitator roles and responsibilities first, and then we'll move on to the members. We are proposing that there are 3 facilitators for the group, particularly to ensure that one of the facilitators would be Spanish speaking, just to make sure that we are providing as many opportunities for inclusion, knowing that we have quite strong networks in Spanish speaking countries and many participating today as well. And then so altogether, we're proposing 3 facilitators. And the responsibilities of the facilitators would be to maintain a list of members so that we've got contact information for all of the members. It would be to organise the meetings or workshops that the group may decide to host and hold in order to facilitate the discussion and the drafting process. We're estimating a minimum of 3, but that's really up to the group to determine as you move forward. It would be to liaise with us at BCN to make sure that we can provide support to you with interpretation needs or any other technology needs for your meetings or your workshops or any other processes that you may design. It would be to facilitate your meetings and the terms of reference that you as a group want to put forward and how you want to approach developing the thematic brief. So facilitating those discussions and those processes, to facilitate the actual meetings where you start to discuss the content of your thematic brief, and to facilitate members to provide inputs into the drafts, facilitate that drafting process itself, bringing all the ideas together and bringing that into a draft, the review and feedback process. And then there would also be at the end, we're asking all of the task force to present their completed drafts back to the Global Policy and Advocacy Group and to have that discussion with the group. So there would be a role for the facilitators in liaising to coordinate that presentation and meeting, and then facilitating the group to participate and present to the Global Policy and Advocacy Group. So that's in brief what we would anticipate the responsibilities are. You might find as you move forward and start to discuss this in more detail, you might want to add or change this or develop it into a broader TOR, but that would be probably the basics of the role and responsibility. The next Jamboard is the member roles. And this would be for everybody else who is participating in the group. And it would be a commitment to respond to and to be engaged actively in the communication, responding to emails, things like that, in a timely manner so that the facilitators are able to do their roles. It would be participating in at least the virtual meetings that are planned by the group. Again, we're estimating approximately 3, but that's up to the group to determine, and providing inputs into the structure and the content of the brief, to provide input into the drafting process, to provide feedback in the review process, and to participate in the presentation of the finalised draft to the Global Policy and Advocacy Working Group. So again, this is sort of the basics of it, but it's up to the group if you choose to moving forward, if you want to flesh this out any further. Next board just shows here what resources we're making available to enable this participation engagement in the task force and to support the group to be able to develop the thematic brief. So we're proposing a stipend for all participants. There would be 2 levels of stipends just to recognise the difference in the workload between the facilitation role and the member role. And so we're proposing a $1,000 stipend for the 3 co-facilitators and a $500 stipend for all other members. We would also commit to ensuring that we had available interpretation for all of your virtual meetings or workshops, and also for any support you might require around drafting with that as well. We do want to make sure that you're able to participate in other languages. If there's additional support members require for internet access and cards or things like that, they are the kinds of things that we would welcome the group raising with us. We do want to make sure we remove any of those kinds of barriers. And we will provide support with the design and the layout of the thematic brief. And again, If other things come up as you're progressing with this work, where you identify there are additional support needs, the group would be very welcome to raise that with us at any time. And we will certainly engage in that conversation to make sure that we're removing any of those barriers to being able to complete this work, but also to enable meaningful participation from all of the members. So that just outlines the resources that are available and the roles and responsibilities of those roles.